Hey everyone, so we're going to take a look at animation. I'm just going to do a really simple bouncing ball because I'm not going to spend too long getting into either animation principles, which are something you should definitely look into, by the way. If you just Google animation principles, you'll get 12 the Disney's 12 basic principles, and you'll probably run into the 10 principles of motion design as well, which are like a slightly more up-to-date simplified version of those, that are much the same. That is worth looking at even for outside of animating models per se, um, because you will still apply principles like that in anything that moves, right? Your character controllers, your UI, reactivity and feedback, all sorts of stuff. So definitely recommend looking at those. Um, so if I look at 12 basic principles of animation, we get this stuff. Right? We get 12 basic principles and our 10 principles of motion design. Right. So that's all I looked up. All right. Um, this one's the GIF. There we go. Right, so this is our 12 basic principles. Worth looking into. We're just going to do some simple squash and stretch and a little bit of sort of our easing and anticipation and stuff. Right. A lot of them kind of overlap, loosely overlap, but worth looking at. All right. We're just going to do a bouncy ball and we're going to get it into the engine. I'm not going to do like a full read character or anything like that. And we're not going to spend too much time in the engines either. We're just going to do a simplified sort of play the one animation, ball that will bounce forever, and talk about the different systems. But we're not going to make a full animation blueprint or a full animator graph or anything like that. Okay. Anyway, let's make our ball. So I'm just going to make a ball, nice and easy. But I am going to move its pivot point to the bottom, just so that it's moving relative to the bottom of the object. Right. Oh, it's not right on the bottom, that's why. Okay. All right, and freeze my transforms. And now I'm going to move over to my animation workspace, which will give me this graph editor, which just lets me have a little bit more control over the way that my model moves and reacts. So the main thing, though, that we need to do is our keyframes, right? We probably want to get our speed and everything right first. So I'm going to work at probably 24 frames a second. 24 is standard for film and TV type animation. Obviously, games, we usually want it a little bit higher, but that's less about the animation. Then the reason we want frame rates higher in games is for reactivity. So if it's something that has to respond to inputs, we need to make sure that it's much higher. But something we're just watching can be quite a bit lower, and it's fine. But you'll notice that's incredibly fast. That ball's going to melt very, very quickly. So I'm just going to make everything a lot longer. So I'm going to make this at 24 FPS. I'm going to make it a good 500 frames or something. That's about right. All right. So now the basic principle for this is just key driven. So I set a key, which I can do from here or from here, or by just pressing S, right, with the object selected. And then I move it. Well, I go to the frame that I want. So the peak of my jump, maybe around here. I move it and I key, right? And I can see my graph and I can see this little red line, and this all gets redded out. So that's a common mistake is people accidentally hit S and add a keyframe to something and then wonder why they can't change any of its settings. That's why you might need to, if you do that when you're not animating, you can go in and delete it from the timeline. Okay? So move to where it's going to land, somewhere around 400. And we'll do a little bit of an extra bounce, little one. Doing this kind of by feel. And then right at 500 where it loops on the ground as well, right? Oh. And this is going to be pretty wonky, but it moves, right? Now, we can manipulate more than just the scale though. We can, the position, we can also manipulate the scale, right? We can do all this. But before I do that, I'm actually going to change the way that I'm handling this. So this is the simple way of handling an animation. We just keyframe directly on the model. And this is actually pretty good for a lot of circumstances like this, where we're just moving one shape. We don't have like a character that deforms and all this sort of stuff that's a lot more intricate. But whereas this will import just fine into Unity, Unreal doesn't recognize models that don't have a skeleton. It won't handle animations from models that don't have a skeleton. Which it is pretty standard for anything that animates to have a skeleton, but it is a little bit unnecessary for something as simple as this, right? Now this would go into Unity just fine, but Unity will handle a skeleton exactly the same way anyway, and I want to show this in both. So I am going to show you how to give this a skeleton. So I'm actually going to delete all of this. I'm not going to keep it, right? And go back to 0, put you back on the ground, right back where we started. And I'm going to rig this, but I'm only going to do the most basic rig in the world. I'm literally going to give it one joint, right? So I'm going to go create joints, rigging, create joints, or it'll be in here somewhere, right? And then I'm not even going to drag out. I'm just going to click to create a bone, right? Now, I'm just going to click off. I'm not going to make that again. If I were making a more complex shape, I'm just going to do this over on the side here very quickly, where I add a whole bunch of subdivisions and maybe I give it more joints. Bam, 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 right? So it's actually got a skeleton that goes the whole way along, right? It's not attached to it yet, so I can still go in and manipulate this if I've fucked anything up. And so I made a joint for every subdivision. Now what I can do is I can grab this, starting from the root, shift click this, and then hit bind skin, right? And now the reason we do this, if I move the joint, bends the model, right? And that's what we'd have to do if we were doing something more complicated, like a character, right? We need to have bones the whole way along. You can also go in and adjust this skin, which you would have to do with character. You notice how like moving this joint drags this a little bit. We probably don't want that, right? Want this more or less stay where it is. So we could go in and adjust the weight painting, actually paint the influence of these joints in, but I'm not going to get too into that today. That's character modeling. It's a lot more complicated than what we're doing. But you will also notice I can't actually move this model anymore because it's locked to the skeleton. I move the skeleton, not the model, right? And that's going to be the same over here. Once I bind that single joint to my sphere. So I don't actually animate the sphere anymore in here. I animate the joint. I did that. I animate the joint instead. Now, normally for a more complex skeleton, you would actually bind a whole bunch of controls. Like you'd make these little simple shapes and constrain them to the joints to make it a little bit easier to handle. But because we only have the one joint, it really doesn't matter. And I'm going to just work from that joint. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing I just did. I'm going to start with the basic flow of things. Right? Not bad start. Not what I meant to focus on. That's what I meant to focus on. All right. But just the movement's not enough. I'm going to actually add a little bit of anticipation here. Move you back down. And I'm going to squash you a little bit. And at the peak here, or actually just after the peak, I'm going to stretch you a little bit. Okay, I won't stretch you there. I'll stretch you right as you're about to hit. Then you'll increase as you go. Bump. Whoop. And then we hit. And I'm going to squash you again. Yep. Little bit of a stretch here. Much smaller squish here. Got more character now, right? The timing's still a little bit off. We should probably hang here a little bit more so I could get in here and grab this. And I can unbind these controls so I can break my tangents. And then I can move these, or I should be able to move those. Why aren't you letting me move those? Sorry. Beta tangents. There we go. Yeah, there we go. Now you let me move it. So I can drag this out a little bit. And now it'll hang a little bit more at the top. Yeah, there's a little bit more of a hang at the top here, right? So you can do stuff like that with these curves until it feels right. Then once it feels right, we can get this over to the engine. Now, one important thing to note is you actually need to export the model and the joint because the animation is actually attached to the joint, not to the model. Now, we have obviously all of our different export tools. I find that when I'm dealing with animation, the best one is the game exporter because it has a section for the animation clips. And so I can add a clip and it recognizes that the whole thing is here. But I could have more loops here, right? Like I could have bounce and then I could have roll and I could have all these different things. And I can just cut them up and define them in here. And they'll all export out together. So I'm going to change and save this onto the desktop in a new folder called Roll Bounce, just for now. And I'm just going to call this one bounce. All right, export. And now, if I go to my desktop, close all my engines for a second. In this folder, I have my FBX. I have my model. It's the same as exporting any other model. So I'm going to drag that over into, I'll start with Unity because it's here. Import this in. Click on it. And if I go across to animation, I'll see I have a bounce animation attached to it. And so I should actually be able to see that in here. My timing is very different in Unity to what it was in Maya. I can always adjust that in here. Still got all my curves, and I can bind events to it and all this sort of stuff in here. Where is? I'll just do the animation on the actual animation file, the speed in the file. All right. So I'm going to drag this into my scene. It's just a model, has a skeleton and a model, right? And on my parent, I'm just going to add an animator. I'm going to make an animator over here. Animator controller. Ball controller. Plug that in. Open it up. And in here, I'm going to add my bounce animation that came in with my model. Right, so it's going to straight away go straight into my bounce animation, and I'm just going to pump this speed up 10 or something. And then when I play, nothing happens. I've done something wrong. Oh no, it's still loading. There we go. It bounces. All right, this isn't set to loop, and so it'll only go once. But I could always go into my model, animation, loop time, apply. So now it's a looping animation. Eventually it'll start running. There we go. Bounce. Bounce. Right. Now, there's all sorts of resources on how to set up an animator. That's not what this tutorial is about. It's just about setting up an animation in Maya, bringing it into Unity in the first place. So if you want to make anything more complex or a series of them, I recommend looking at how to set up an animator. All right, so let's get across to Unreal. Let's do the same thing over here. So bring in ball bounce. Now, differing from when we imported any other model, we want to make sure that it is a skeletal mesh when we import it. We import the mesh and the skeleton, it's going to create its own skeleton. Not going to worry about that. All right, import animations, the export time, this is all fine, this is all fine, this is all fine. Import. Right? And so we actually get a bunch of different things when this happens. We get our model, which is a different color. It's a skeletal mesh and not a static mesh. We get an animation sequence, we get a skeleton, and we get a physics asset. We get a bunch of things that come in with it. So I'm just going to drag my model in, right? And my model, now it will ask to if it wants to use an animation blueprint or an animation asset or some sort of custom mode. An animation blueprint is basically like our animator. It's a big state tree thing for handling, listening for inputs, and playing different animations under different circumstances and all sorts of stuff like that. Again, whole lot of resources out there on how to set up animation blueprints. Not what I'm going to get into. So all I'm going to do is use an animation asset, and it's going to play its bounce. It's going to loop. It's going to play straight away, and it's going to start from the start. Hit start, and it bounces. It's obviously still way too slow because of our timing in Maya differing from our timing in Unreal. So I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to change the rate scale to 10. Right, so it's going to be 10 times faster. Right, play. There we go. And my ball bounces. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good start on how to make animations in Maya and bring them into Unity and Unreal. If you want to get into how to blend animations, tie animations to inputs, all that sort of stuff, I recommend looking at Animator tutorials for or animation controller tutorials for Unity and animation blueprint tutorials for Unreal.